today, and we're moving from the more aquatic region to the land-based region, and we're moving to the US, where we will look at the fossil-rich wilderness. Tobias, are you there, Tobias?
Yeah, I'm here. It
Perfect.
says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Yeah, let me just invite you to start the video. There we go.
All right.
Perfect. Okay, we can also see your screen.
All right.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Well, that was an interesting transition there from what I just caught, what Max was saying. Well, welcome, and thank you all for choosing to join this webinar entitled Stewarding Wilderness in the Anthropocene, Fish and Wildlife Management in the Fossil-Rich Wilderness in Colorado. And my goal with this presentation is to provide a deeper analysis and nuanced discussion of the highly complex and sometimes controversial nature of fish and wildlife management inside designated wilderness areas using the fossil-rich wilderness as a case study. And I must caution that this presentation may be fairly specific to the US wilderness context, legislation, and policy. However, I did try to identify some overarching themes that I hope will be relevant to an international audience. And I also hope that this presentation will stimulate some discussion and conversation about how practices and perspectives on this topic may differ and can inform one another. And I ask that if you have questions, maybe, I don't know how we're going to do this, but type them in the chat. And I plan to leave about 15 minutes at the end for some discussion, and I'm excited to answer your questions at the end. So before I dive in, I would like to take a brief moment to introduce myself. My name is Tobias. I was born and grew up in Germany until I moved to the United States at age 16. I earned a bachelor degree in philosophy, political science, and environmental science from the University of San Diego. And during and after my undergraduate degree, I worked for several conservation organizations, including in wilderness specialist positions with the US Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. I am currently a graduate student pursuing a degree in a master's in environmental management with a concentration in public land management here at Western Colorado University in the Rocky Mountains. And like you all, I have a deep passion for stewarding, defending, and learning about wilderness. So as far as the outline for this presentation goes, I want to begin by recognizing and briefly discussing the interdependence of wilderness and wildlife. Then I want to highlight some of the connections between wildlife management and wilderness management and how wildlife management actions influence wilderness character. Next, I'll explore some of the wilderness stewardship dilemmas and challenges associated with wildlife management. And with this general understanding and framework in place, I will then introduce the fossil-rich wilderness and provide some concrete local examples of trying to navigate these wilderness stewardship challenges. I will introduce my master's project with the Forest Service of developing a fish and wildlife management plan for this wilderness and discuss the process and challenges of selecting and conserving priority species in this wilderness. I will conclude with some key themes and takeaways that emerged from this case study. Okay, so it likely comes as no surprise to anyone in this audience that wilderness and wildlife are engaged in a reciprocal relationship and fundamentally depend on one another. While this is obvious, I do want to recognize this here and briefly explore these interrelationships because much of what I will cover in the remainder of the conversation will present wilderness and wildlife management as being at odds with one another. So there are many ways in which wilderness benefits wildlife conservation. Generally, protected areas feature prominently in biodiversity strategies locally, nationally, and internationally because they reduce extinction risks by prohibiting and restricting land uses that are deemed as incompatible with conservation. Thereby, they maintain oftentimes large tracts of intact and unfragmented habitat, And this refuge function is likely only going to increase in importance as climate change progresses. Moreover, wilderness allows for natural processes such as disturbance regimes and evolutionary processes to unfold with minimal human intervention. Finally, wilderness serves as a laboratory and control for wildlife-related research and provides a baseline for wildlife restoration and rewilding places elsewhere. Now, on the flip side, wildlife is an integral component of wilderness character, both culturally for many people and then ecologically by maintaining ecosystem processes and functions. Therefore, the presence or absence of species is an indicator of wilderness character, as is reflected here in the United States in national wilderness character monitoring and stewardship programs. Now, the guidance documents of which I've two examples here on the right-hand side. So how does fish and wildlife management relate to wilderness management, and how does it influence wilderness character? And I apologize, this is going to be a pretty busy slide coming up here, but I do think it is important to present this information in some detail, and I want to walk you through this conceptual model. So first, I want to briefly touch on this concept of wilderness character that I've been mentioning, which here in the United States, wilderness character is broken down into 5 different qualities derived from the language of the Wilderness Act of 1964. And the untrammeled quality, or what is often referred to as wildness, describes wilderness as a place that is self-willed and not subjugated to human design's purposes. The natural quality refers to ecological systems, processes, and organisms that are free from the effects of modern civilization. The undeveloped quality describes wilderness as a place free from roads, structures, and even installations such as weather station or even small things like wildlife cameras. The undeveloped quality also includes the absence of motorized equipment and vehicles such as chainsaws or snowmobiles. Wilderness is also supposed to provide and be managed for opportunities for solitude and unconfined and primitive recreation. Lastly, wilderness may exhibit other features of value such as cultural or paleontological resources. So how do these qualities of wilderness, I do want to stress that these qualities of wilderness character are ideals or desired conditions, and they all exist on a continuum. So how do these qualities of wilderness character relate to native fish and wildlife? Well, the untrammeled quality, as I said, preserves natural disturbance regimes and allows evolutionary processes to unfold, thus benefiting native fauna. On the flip side, native fish and wildlife maintain ecosystem composition, structure, and function, which is integral to the natural quality of wilderness character. The undeveloped quality guarantees unfragmented habitat to native fish and wildlife, while managing for solitude ensures safety from human disturbance for wildlife. And finally, in some cases, native fish and wildlife constitute ethnographic resources, and endemic or endangered species may be included under the other features of value quality. So far we have a pretty harmonious picture here, but it becomes more complicated once we add anthropogenic stressors, such as the ones that I've listed here on the right-hand side. And many of these originate outside of wilderness, but they do degrade wilderness ecosystems and therefore impact native fish and wildlife inside wilderness. Now, these impacts in turn are increasingly leading to pressures to take management action and reverse or mitigate those impacts and protect vulnerable species. Now, if things go according to plan, which they don't always do, these ecological restoration projects are intended to benefit native fish and wildlife in the wilderness. However, and importantly, from a wilderness perspective, these projects exert human control and manipulate the biophysical environment. And despite their good intentions, they do degrade the untrammeled quality of wilderness. So in other words, management of fish and wildlife may be in conflict with the Wilderness Act of 1964, which directs managers to leave tracts of land in a largely unmanaged condition outside of human desire, control, and utility. So this then leads to what has been referred to in the literature as the dilemma of wilderness stewardship. And these dilemmas usually center on this tension between the natural and the untrammeled qualities of wilderness character, at least here in the United States. So to reiterate, the untrammeled quality describes wilderness as self-willed and not subjugated to human purposes and intentional manipulation. The natural quality describes wilderness as free from the effects of modern civilization. I do want to stress that word effects there because that's the strong contrast that comes into play. And what it seems that these two qualities focus on similar concepts, they are unfortunately increasingly linked in an inverse relationship. And I've listed a couple examples of here that highlight these oppositions. So for example, applying herbicide to eradicate invasive plant species in wilderness benefits the natural quality, but clearly is an intentional manipulation of the ecosystem. Similarly, igniting prescribed burns to restore fire regimes that have been altered due to climate change, past fire suppression, or even removal of indigenous peoples is another example. Also, reintroducing native species that have been extirpated by humans highlights this conflict. So as a result, there is an inherent tension between the natural and untrammeled qualities that inevitably results in decision trade-offs, which have become increasingly characteristic of wilderness management and a source of controversy really here in the United States. And at its core, there is a fundamental disagreement about what wilderness is, what it should be, and how it should be managed in the Anthropocene. So, and I also want to stress that these wilderness stewardship dilemmas are not just something to be dealt with in the future, but at least here in the US, they're a concern right now. For example, a survey conducted by Lieberman and her fellow authors of wilderness managers in the United States found that ecological restoration efforts took place in 37% of US wilderness areas between 2011 and 2015. And from some of my personal observations, I would add that in some wilderness areas, such as Grand Canyon, where I used to work, multiple ecological restoration projects are going on at any given time. And so as a result, Landry's et al. In their 2020 paper, I think pretty astutely observed, and I quote, "The combination of climate change with other landscape stressors is driving ecological restoration to be one of the most important, challenging, and potentially litigious wilderness stewardship issues." And this situation becomes even more problematic, at least here in the US, due to the fact that, and again, I quote from the Landry's paper, "Decisions allowing or denying restoration in wilderness are currently made on a case-by-case basis in the context of scientific uncertainty, ambiguous law and policy, and competing values." So it is within this context of scientific uncertainty, ambiguous law and policy, and competing values that my master's project in the fossil-rich wilderness took shape. Okay, I want to briefly pause here. See, there was some action in the chat. Okay, we'll return to some of those in the end. So with this understanding and framework in place that I've provided so far, I want to virtually welcome you all, and especially our international participants, to the fossil-rich wilderness. And the fossil-rich wilderness is a very special place to me, dear to my heart, that I've become to know quite intimately over the past year or so. And the fossil-rich wilderness is nestled in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado in the central United States. And I've provided in the top right-hand corner is a map of the state of Colorado. And the fossil-rich wilderness is approximately a 4-hour drive from the state capital of Denver, which is basically where those interstate highways converge. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. And the wilderness lies approximately 15 miles northeast of the small town of Gunnison, which has a population of approximately 6,000 people and is the location of Western Colorado University. And as you can also see in this map, the fossil-rich wilderness is largely surrounded by other kinds of public lands, which are shaded in light green and yellow here. And there are also several other wilderness areas in the vicinity in dark green. And somewhat unique for the US, the fossil-rich wilderness is surrounded by sort of buffer zone, which is entitled the Fossil-Rich Recreation Management Area, and is depicted in light brown here surrounding the wilderness. And there's some land uses that are prohibited in that buffer zone, such as logging. So to provide some fast facts about the fossil-rich wilderness, it is entirely administered by the United States Forest Service. It was designated through the Colorado Wilderness Act of 1993. It encompasses approximately 33,000 acres. It spans an elevation from 8,800 to over 13,000 feet and protects mostly alpine and subalpine forested ecosystems. And it is named after marine fossils that are embedded in limestone layers and used to be on the ocean floor, but have been pushed up by tectonic forces to over 13,000 feet, forming the high alpine ridges of this wilderness. And fortunately, I think the fossil-rich wilderness, for now at least, remains somewhat of a hidden gem here in the Rocky Mountains, and receives substantially less use and attention than some of our surrounding wilderness areas in Colorado. So for my master's project, I entered into a wilderness fellowship with the US Forest Service and was tasked with developing an indigenous fish and wildlife management strategy for this wilderness. And to avoid confusion, I want to clarify that the word indigenous here in this context is used interchangeably with native species. So the purpose of this strategy is to inform and empower local land managers to make carefully weighted fish and wildlife management decisions that respect and preserve wilderness character and ensure the persistence or recovery of selected priority species faced with direct or indirect human pressures. So if we return to this conceptual model from earlier, this strategy essentially is a response to the increasing anthropogenic pressures threatening fish and wildlife species inside wilderness. And the strategy outlines management actions to conserve priority species, but I think perhaps more importantly, it seeks to facilitate careful, informed decision-making that balances both biodiversity and wilderness objectives, and navigate in a transparent way these stewardship dilemmas that I discussed earlier in the presentation. So why do we need this strategy? Beyond fulfilling US Forest Service policy requirements, some of the main reasons why this strategy is needed include to cooperatively develop management objectives that then guide conservation efforts and sustain biodiversity in the fossil-rich wilderness. This strategy is further needed to facilitate coordination among and communication among stakeholders in the management of fish and wildlife resources in the fossil-rich wilderness. And along with that, and I think perhaps most importantly, this strategy is intended as a tool to educate resource specialists and agency partners and other stakeholders on this concept of wilderness character and clarify how fish and wildlife management influence wilderness character. And the ultimate goal with that is that wilderness management decisions are made in a more transparent and defensible way. Additionally, the strategy seeks to preserve institutional knowledge of the wilderness and its native fauna and provide a pilot project or a case study that will then guide the development of similar types of management plans for other wilderness areas. So one of the most difficult and consequential challenges that I had in developing this management plan was the selection of priority species for the wilderness. And unfortunately, there's relatively little guidance on how to make these kinds of selections. So based on available resources and other existing government planning documents, I stitched together a definition of priority species, which in this context, I defined as indigenous or native species for which there is a perceived management need now or in the foreseeable future. And I compiled a long list of potential priority species based on consulting the scientific literature and government planning documents and databases, and then narrowed down that list through stakeholder analysis and interviews and made a final selection of 4 priority species. And then in line with this theme of transparency and defensibility, I provided rationales for selection of each priority species, as well as explanations for why certain species were omitted from the management plan. So for each priority species, I went through identical steps, including a literature review and discussion of the species life cycle, its habitat requirements and threats, a status assessment of the species inside the wilderness, development of management objectives to conserve and recover the priority species, as well as making management recommendations to accomplish those objectives. I also included contingency planning actions for potential future scenarios and to adapt to those, and an analysis of trade-offs involved in those management actions, specifically in a wilderness context. And finally, I included a monitoring framework to evaluate the effectiveness of management actions and adapt future management. So here are the 4 priority species selected for the fossil-rich wilderness. And in the remainder of the presentation, I will highlight some of the, I will discuss some of the highlights for management of each of these species. And while these species are largely unique to North America and the Rocky Mountains, I hope that there are some themes that are relevant for management of wildlife in other regions. So starting with Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, the principal reason for the range-wide decline of this species is the transmission of pathogens from domesticated livestock, such as domestic sheep and goats. And the particular bighorn herd that ranges through the fossil-rich wilderness experienced a disease outbreak in the winter of 2007-2008 after coming in close proximity with cattle. And during the following die-off, the herd was reduced from over 60 to less than 15 individuals, and recovery of the herd has been extremely slow. And this is pretty common because surviving bighorn that survived the initial die-off event continue to pass on pathogens to lambs that are born, thereby depressing recruitment and population growth, sometimes for well over a decade after the initial outbreak. So the primary challenge with bighorns in this wilderness areas, the fossil wilderness area here in the map on the right is outlined in dark green. Essentially, the wilderness is too small because the bighorn continue to migrate in and out of the wilderness boundaries. So in summer, the bighorns concentrate in the alpine and subalpine areas of the wilderness, which is highlighted here in orange. But in winter, the bighorn herd migrate to lower elevation, as shown in the dark blue areas. And during the extreme winter of 2007-2008, the bighorn sheep were pushed onto private lands and ranches, where they came in very close proximity with domesticated livestock and contracted the respiratory disease that resulted in the subsequent die-off. So in the case of bighorn sheep, the migration patterns and risk for disease transmission highlights the need for wilderness managers to collaborate across jurisdictional and ownership boundaries. So some of the management actions that we're currently implementing or planning to implement to protect this species include several, such as aerial surveys to monitor bighorn sheep herds, focusing on minimizing the risk of future disease transmission by separating bighorn sheep from domestic livestock, monitoring bighorn sheep mountain goat interactions. So there's mountain goats present in this wilderness, and they're most likely not native to the area and are often more aggressive, the more aggressive and dominant species, and potentially outcompeting the bighorns. Also, we're monitoring visitor use in the fossil-rich wilderness. And as growing population and increasing demand for outdoor recreation has taken place here in Colorado, we've seen increasing impacts of recreation on wildlife species. Although little is known right now about the impact of recreation on bighorns, which warrants some additional research. And finally, we're seeking to promote connectivity between the fossil-rich herd and other herds in the region through, for example, through siting highway over and underpasses along migration corridors, of course, outside wilderness. In terms of contingency planning, there's a few options such as population augmentation and predator control that could be a last resort to ensure the persistence of bighorn in the wilderness, although they're fairly unlikely to be implemented in this wilderness at least. But there are options that are on the table depending on future development of future scenarios and the health of the herd. There are also several wilderness considerations specifically that come into play with management of this species. So for example, the species highlights that tension between the untrammeled and natural qualities. Specifically, actions such as population augmentation, predator control, or in the past, capturing and collaring bighorns or administering drug treatments are clear examples of trammeling actions. Now, because this herd's range spans areas inside and outside wilderness, there are management opportunities that could result in conservation gains for this herd without requiring any intervention inside wilderness. In addition, aircraft use, low-flying aircraft over wilderness has been a long debated issue, as well as the question of what constitutes appropriate research inside wilderness is a subject of debate and even controversy, at least from my experience here in the United States. Okay, moving on to the Colorado River cutthroat trout. So fish stocking has been a common practice in the American West since essentially the mid-1800s, and it has taken place in the fossil-rich wilderness since at least 1952, although that's only how far our records go back. We're pretty sure it went on before that. And the principal threat to Colorado River cutthroat trout are non-native salmonoid species that compete with, hybridize with, and prey on the native cutthroat trout. And of course, ironically, most of these non-native fish were introduced through historic fish stocking. And climate change also presents a potential future threat to Colorado River cutthroat trout as rising stream temperatures impact cutthroat trout fitness and survival potentially in the future. So given this concern over climate change, the Forest Service has modeled stream temperatures for the entire American West for different climate change scenarios, depending on different emission scenarios. And the map on the left shows stream temperatures for the baseline period from 1993 to 2011. And on the right, we have predicted stream temperatures for 2040 and 2080 for the fossil-rich wilderness. And essentially, the main takeaway from this map is that the high elevation streams of the fossil-rich wilderness could provide cold water refugia for this native cutthroat trout species. So some current management actions taking place in the wilderness for this species include the stocking of fish via aircraft and surveying potential recovery streams. Now, despite these ongoing fish stockings of cutthroat trout, and so we no longer stock the non-native fish, fortunately, at least in this area, but despite stocking the Colorado River cutthroat trout, no self-sustaining population has become established. So some future contingency actions that could be taken to support conservation of the species in the wilderness include the installation of fish barriers to prevent the migration of non-native fish from downstream, the chemical treatment of waters to eradicate non-native salmonid species, which would then be followed by introducing a genetically pure population of Colorado River cutthroat trout, and then monitoring that population going forward and maintaining its genetic purity. Now, clearly, as these photos highlight on the right-hand side, these conservation actions would be are very intrusive in a wilderness setting and come with some substantial trade-offs. So for one, the untrammeled quality would suffer substantially through actions such as chemically treating streams to eradicate non-native fish. Furthermore, management of this particular species really highlights the conflict between social and ecological values. So fish stocking is continuing not because managers think it's a good thing for the ecosystem, but because people like to go fishing, and that in turn generates revenue for the state of Colorado. And in fact, studies have shown that most of these high elevation alpine lakes used to be fishless historically. But unfortunately, fish stocking in the entire American West has become so ubiquitous that fishless lakes, which were historically in the alpine commonplace, are now one of the rarest and most threatened ecosystems in Colorado. So going forward, I suggest that managers should consider restoring some selected lakes to their historically fishless condition. But unfortunately, this is a huge challenge. And the main problem is that we have these so-called grandfathered in uses that pre-exist the designation of the wilderness. And the state wildlife agencies, which carry out the fish stocking, are likely to continue to exercise that right to stock fish via aircraft into the foreseeable future. So regardless of where one stands on this issue of fish stocking, this species really highlights the crucial need for collaboration between the state wildlife agency, which carries out the fish stocking, and the federal agencies, in this case, the US Forest Service, which manages the land in the wilderness. And both agencies need to identify and work towards a shared vision of conservation and protection of this wilderness, of the wilderness character. Lastly, this species also highlights the important role that taxonomy and genetic research has played in informing conservation. In particular, as new tools have become available, genetic research of Colorado River cutthroat trout has significantly affected and informed management of native cutthroat trout here in Colorado in recent decades, and will continue to do so as new research comes out. All righty, another priority species is the Boreal Toad. The principal threat to this species is the chytrid fungus, which is responsible for declines and even extinctions of many amphibian species worldwide. And at this point, we know very little about the Boreal Toad in the fossil-rich wilderness. So some management recommendations include identification of suitable habitat, surveying its current distribution, and testing for the presence of chytrid fungus. And contingent upon those survey findings and several other policy and regulatory factors, reintroduction of this species in the fossil-rich wilderness may be warranted. And such reintroduction would constitute a classic case of trammeling, that is a deliberate action and intervention in the biophysical environment to benefit the natural quality of wilderness character. However, I would argue that it does not involve any prohibited uses and would be relatively non-intrusive. And when we look at management opportunities inside and outside the wilderness to conserve this species, there is an argument that could be made that we should prioritize the fossil-rich wilderness for reintroduction, because it provides some of the best, most suitable, unfragmented habitat for this species. And that, moreover, this potential habitat is located at high elevations, which has been shown to slow the growth of this fungus due to the climate at those elevations here in the Rocky Mountains. So, and also one more thing is that the reintroduction of boreal toads to the fossil ridge could then promote metapopulation dynamics and functionality, and increase the resilience of local populations of this species. And finally, the southern white-tailed ptarmigan. This is a bird that spends its entire life cycle above or at tree line. And as an alpine obligate species, this bird is considered vulnerable to climate change, which may have a disproportionate and accelerated impact on alpine ecosystems. So the white-tailed ptarmigan was primarily included in this strategy as an indicator species to monitor the health of alpine ecosystems, which make up about a quarter of the fossil-rich wilderness. And some management recommendations proposed for this species in the strategy include inventorying and monitoring of wild-tailed ptarmigan populations in the wilderness, evaluating habitat, particularly winter habitat, which consists of willow-dominated plant communities and is known to be a limiting factor for the species in Colorado. Minimizing grazing impacts in the alpine, especially on those willow communities. Also recording historic mine sites, which are all over the landscape in Colorado, because studies have shown that heavy metals mobilized at those mine sites adversely impact this species. Yeah, as mentioned previously, we're seeing a rapid increase in recreation and visitor use in Colorado, especially in those alpine areas as people want to bag those peaks. And this is something we're monitoring and something that we may need to address in the future through additional educational programs and restrictions on visitor behavior. Also, for this species, trail maintenance plays a role, as poorly designed and poorly maintained trails can alter the flow of water across the landscape and thereby dewater the especially the winter habitat, some of the winter habitat for this species. And finally, as climate change progresses, there's a concern that, especially for alpine species, that they may become increasingly fragmented and isolated. And genetic sampling can help us to evaluate connectivity among different white-tailed ptarmigan populations and look for indications of inbreeding and genetic drift. So some wilderness-specific considerations. Well, for one, management opportunities for the species outside of wilderness are actually limited, ironically, because we have done such a good job of protecting its habitat in these alpine areas as wilderness here in Colorado. There's a bias towards high elevation, rugged topography being wilderness, while a lot of the lower elevation ecosystems, go unprotected oftentimes. In addition, this species highlights the challenge of preserving the natural quality of wilderness character in the face of shifting environmental conditions. And finally, this species also highlights the tension between conservation and recreation. In the US, by law, in wilderness where managers are supposed to provide opportunities for unconfined recreation, that is recreation unencumbered by regulations and management constraints. However, as recreation and associated impacts are increasing, visitor restrictions may become increasingly necessary to deal with some of those impacts. So I want to wrap up with some concluding thoughts about wilderness stewardship in the Anthropocene that emerged from my work in the fossil-rich wilderness. One question that I wrestled with throughout this project was whether we're witnessing and whether we need a paradigm shift in wilderness management that is away from the passive hands-off management of the past towards a more active approach that involves ecological restoration to address intensifying anthropogenic pressures. And regardless what I may think, for better or worse, there is evidence that this shift is already happening, at least in the United States context. And I think that managers will increasingly have to stake out a middle ground position between these two different visions for wilderness management. As anthropogenic stresses intensify and as pressures to intervene in wilderness increase, the tensions between the untrammeled quality and the natural quality of wilderness character is becoming increasingly apparent and lies at the heart of many wilderness stewardship decisions. Because of these tensions, managers are increasingly confronted with inherent trade-offs in their decision-making, and we need to recognize and carefully evaluate those trade-offs. Now, these tensions and dilemmas of wilderness stewardship are further compounded and made difficult by the fact that what Landry's called a context of scientific uncertainty, ambiguous law and policy, and competing values over what wilderness is, what it should be, and how it should be managed. Given this context, there is a great need for transparency, communication, and collaboration among wilderness managers, agency staff, and other stakeholders. And this need for collaboration is further highlighted by the fact that most threats to wilderness originate from outside wilderness, and that stewardship needs to occur across boundaries and jurisdictions. And this is, of course, especially true for wildlife management, as animals move in and outside wilderness boundaries, and usually multiple agencies are involved in their management. Additionally, the amount of uncertainty and rapid socio-ecological change that characterize the Anthropocene makes conservation planning more difficult and requires built-in flexibility, scenario planning, and contingency planning, and integration of adaptive management principles and monitoring, and more frequent periodic revision of these management plans. And then to conclude, I think more than ever, we need humility, thoughtfulness, and collaborative stewardship to protect wilderness and wildlife through the Anthropocene. With that, I want to thank you all for listening and providing me this opportunity to share my work. And I'm sorry this was not more interactive, but I look forward to answering your questions in the remaining time that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias.
Tobias. Nick, I'm jumping in here.
Yeah, I was about to say it will become very interactive, I presume, with Max. So let's go.
Tobias, I think you made a very good case why these interventions, I'm not saying are needed, but make sense. But let me challenge you. I don't think it is an issue about whether or not we should do these. I think what we are overseeing is when we go back to Rob Nash's, Rob Leslie's, I'm going to kick you out of the sharing there quickly, into the, where the hell is my screen now? I love Zoom. It always surprises me. When we go back to the wilderness continuum, which you know quite well,
Right.
It allows that human modification intervention. The real question is not should we or should we not intervene in wilderness, but the question is, once we intervene, is it still wilderness? It may still have the name, but de facto, we are moving the wilderness from the right-hand side into the wild-land category, which is okay. Like, this is absolutely fine.
Right.
The problem, what we now have is, we are still using the terminology wilderness for areas in which we are actively intervening, where we are actively managing. And you've shown quite nicely, and I loved your presentation, the shifting baseline. When you're suddenly talking about building dams and treating water and predator control, oh my God, it's a different word than hunting.
Yeah.
It's a fancy word, which is fine if you want to save a certain species at the cost of another species. So we're suddenly trading off species as well. That's all fine. You can do that in the urban, intensive use, agricultural, semi-natural, and even wild lands. But then it's not a wilderness anymore. What do you say to that?
Well, there's a lot to be said there. Couple thoughts come to mind. I mean, for one, I would say, and personally, first of all, I want to say I'm so honored to be presenting at the same presentation as the son of Howard Zahniser. That is truly, and I love Howard Zahniser's writing. I'm a huge fan of Untrammeled Wilderness. In fact, when I was given this project of developing a fish and wildlife management plan in wilderness, I was at first a little hesitant and confused. What does that even mean? You know, does that even make sense? But I think it's a very nuanced topic, and a couple of responses here. First of all, anthropogenic pressures are already moving all wilderness areas to the left of that continuum. And I think the case could be made that in some cases, intervention, might edge some areas a little bit back in the right direction, such as when we are reintroducing wolves in Colorado here, potentially, depending on how the vote goes in November. Yes, bringing wolves from Canada or Yellowstone, whatever, down to Colorado is an intervention, but, wouldn't that also restore some of the wildness of these landscapes? Another thought that comes to mind is this idea of, wilderness versus biodiversity. I showed in the beginning that they're very intertwined, but with this continuum, in order to protect biodiversity, are we moving away from this concept of wilderness? And I think that is a big debate to be had. When the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964, climate change, wasn't on anybody's radar. I don't think anyone could have imagined they were certainly the founder, Howard Zahniser and other advocates for the Wilderness Act certainly had a lot of insight and foresight, but I think some of the impacts we're seeing now may have been beyond even their wildest imaginations. And so the question becomes, biodiversity reservations versus wilderness areas. That is increasingly, I think, a conflict we're having. And I do think that we may need to take a middle ground because, and here in the US, we have the Endangered Species Act and we have the Wilderness Act, which come into conflict, and managers are kind of right at the intersection of those two. And we need to fulfill the promise and the mandate of both acts, which is challenging. And one last thought is, recently I listened to a presentation from Dr. Roger Kay, who's a wilderness manager up in Alaska for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he talked about this idea of, maybe we need some wilderness areas that are completely hands-off, especially large wilderness areas, right, that are completely unmanaged. And some of the smaller wilderness areas, close to population centers, where we may strike a little different management approach that includes some ecological restoration. So the fossil-rich wilderness is pretty small. There's, like with a lot of these species migrating in and out of wilderness, and being in Colorado, which is increasingly growing population, it may just be difficult to maintain that wildness condition.
Now you're talking. Now you're talking. Because, by the way, I know the area quite well. I know Pitkin. I know Buena Vista because we spent there many summers. And I love the little Bumblebee C-19 steam engine in Gunnison in the little museum there. I'm a Mile Away Road fan, so I know a little bit also about the history. But here's where we are now talking. I think it is a definition of the terms. And when I talked to John Hausdorfer, we recognized that even though the US was the founding father of the Wilderness Act, once it made it over to Europe, 30, 40 years had passed, we actually modified it because we recognized that the US Wilderness Act has got some, in our eyes, shortcomings. One of them is the touristic use. Mm-hmm. And the second one is this whole predator control, Peter just raised it, this whole management issue. Because most of the US wilderness do not really have, according to Europe, this clear zonation. So when you look at, and I made the case today, the Majella wilderness in Italy, it is 75,000 hectares. It is almost a wilderness, according to the US, of the 75,000 hectares. But only 14,000 hectares of that are absolutely non-managed. And so it is a definition topic that we have here. And maybe you could, and you already alluded to this, and I love it, and I'm going to take this up with John, that maybe the real question you're posing is not, should we not Anthropocene back and forth, but should the US wilderness concept be revised to reflect the new ideas and knowledges that we have gained over the years? And that means maybe for ourselves, it would make sense to put a few areas aside that we really do not intervene, and we let nature run its course. Whatever happens, happens, because maybe we discover in there a resilience that we at the moment are just not aware of, that we are not familiar with, that we oversee in our ambition, in our science approach to keep on intervening. And for that, from Europe, we can tell you that in some of those areas, for example, we have invasive species in those core zones, and everybody screamed and said, you have to intervene, you have to restore and take him out. Now, we observed those, and with Gary Oy, who came over, who was the wilderness director from the US National Park Service, they never spread. The wilderness itself contained those invasive species, but only after we stopped the restoration efforts. Because with every restoration efforts, we actually assisted that invasive species to continue to spread, because many of those ecological processes are so complicated. I mean, we don't even understand what the hell climate change will have an impact. We can model all we want, but we don't really know. Like building a dam in a river is not only helping those native cutthroat trout species, but it's impacting many other species. And why we are maybe one step ahead of it is because you are German, you know that we have the FFH directive. The FFH directive, for our listener, is the European Flora and Fauna Habitat Directive. It actually was passed before the European Union was set up. And about 20% of the European Union is under guidance of this FFH directive. And it lists in Annex 4 and 5 priority species, and you have to increase the conservation status of that species. The wolf, for example, is listed as a threatened species, and all member states must take everything in their power to improve the conservation status. It's an excellent piece of document, but it totally contradicts with wilderness. Because what FFH did was it prioritized, and you did that in your presentation, one species over another species.
Mm-hmm.
And this setting of human priorities in a natural context leads always to disaster. If we didn't learn anything, we should at least have learned from that. Now, again, I'm not saying do not save those species. The cutthroat toad is a species that let's at least give him a chance. But the question then is, are those areas still wilderness areas? Maybe not, maybe according to the US definition. But let's move into the forefront and saying, maybe you need a new definition. And what you currently have as wilderness are in fact more wild areas to Rob Leslie's wilderness continuum. And there should actually be like the wilderness plus at the further right-hand side that says above this, what we so far have called wilderness is the real wilderness where we really do not do anything. And yes, they are smaller. They should be large, but typically they are small.
Yeah, a lot came to mind while you were talking. I mean, I think for one, we could, first of all, I agree, we could learn from Europe and other countries. While we did sort of, the Wilderness Act has been, for a long time, was a little bit the gold standard and was adapted by other countries, including Europe and the European continent. And I think now we could go and learn from how others have interpreted the wilderness concept and what they have done and what management practices they have. So I'm really glad for this opportunity to have this sort of intercultural, international exchange on these topics. And I think particularly this topic of zoning is an important one. And we are doing this in the US already to some extent. Like I remember at Grand Canyon, the management plan included, different levels of wildness within the proposed wilderness there, which becomes problematic too, though, I think, because we already have relatively little wilderness. And then to further, cut that down into like, oh, within this wilderness, only this is real wilderness is like concerning to me in a way as well. Although, those areas close to the trailheads, especially at a place like Grand Canyon that sees millions of visitors a year, what are you going to do? You're going to have to facilitate that recreation use. And like you said, the U.S. Wilderness Act is interesting. It's a product of the 50s and 60s. I love the Wilderness Act. I think it's very poetic, but may it have become slightly dated in some regards? Possibly. I think amending it or changing it is a delicate act because of the political climate we're in. I'm glad the Wilderness Act essentially hasn't been touched. You talked about this issue of social values in wilderness. I mean, I struggle with this because I do love the fact that in this country, we have a piece of legislation that guarantees outstanding opportunities for solitude. I think that is just remarkable and beautiful. But when you throw in these social values into this largely ecological concept of wilderness, it makes it tricky. It makes management difficult as you start to balance these different things. Someone mentioned in the chat, hunting is permissible in wilderness. That is true, at least unless it's a National Park Service wilderness or something like that. But generally, yes, wilderness areas, we're allowed to hunt. And I think that is a good thing, though, because I do think, the hunting quotas are low enough that is not a major factor in influencing the distribution of species. And we also have to think about the fact that, indigenous people are here. So we're talking about persistence hunting up in Alaska, for example. And
but Tobias, for the animal that is killed, for the animal that is taken out of that ecological system, it is a human intervention. We may say it's a
Right.
minimal intervention. So what we are talking about really is, where is the baseline? Is it shifting? I mean, I had with Jeff yesterday a good conversation about the Tasmanian forest, which is a unique rainforest down on Tasmanian Islands. It is threatened by climate change and it is starting to burn. Yes, we are starting to do prescribed burns, but then it's not a wilderness anymore. It has become a wild area, because to do the prescribed burns, you suddenly have to build forest roads. You're talking about the airplanes. You're bringing in water from a different ecosystem, where you may even, dropping water to fight a fire, introduce further species that you should not introduce. So I don't challenge that we should do that. I think we all should try to reduce the loss of biodiversity wherever we can. But the real question is, and yes, they are smaller, but at least we have those smaller areas where the evolution can continue in whichever way it will go. And a desert, if the forest turn into desert, that's not a loss from a wilderness perspective. It's just a different habitat. It's just a different ecosystem. A desert is just a wilderness as a forest. And when forests turn into desert because they burn and whatever happens in there, so what? It's nature. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should do that on a large scale. This is why the idea is 2 to 3%. And yes, we love the U.S. Wilderness Act. It is, watch our website. We like that, and we're pushing forward. But let's think about whether this little bit of modification may be something to really think about and how it could go, because I'm afraid that we are shifting the baseline, and not long from now, there will be dams everywhere and reintroduction and predator control, because it's like a dam where you poke a hole into it, and it will set precedents, and the next one will do it. And also between the 4 different Forest Service and National Park Service, the 4 different interpretation of wilderness is also an issue at stake. Because you do have different services treating wilderness differently. Now, thank God you have it, because in Europe, we don't even have that yet. So.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I usually find myself on the other end of the discussion. I'm usually the one who's defending untrammeled wilderness. Of course, I was given this Forest Service project of fish and wildlife management. And I mean, I think there needs to be a middle ground. There needs to be some compromise. And I think, you know, the truth is evolutionary processes everywhere are affected by water pollution, air pollution, changing atmospheric composition of the changing chemical composition of the atmosphere. You know, so it's, and one of the key questions, of course, becomes this idea of double trammeling, right? I mean, do we have this more like obligation to reverse some of these like issues, like introduction of non-native species, like non-native fish in this case? You know, so the problem there becomes like, do 2 wrongs make a right in a way, which I'm generally not a big fan of. But I mean, we have to recognize, for example, this fire management is, of course, this huge issue. And I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges for wilderness managers here in the Western United States in the 21st century. I worked down on a forest in New Mexico. We had, you know, the general rule for fire in wilderness is allow natural processes to unfold, of course, with many caveats, because fire escapes wilderness, burns infrastructure, affects public safety. So there's a lot of caveats, and the Wilderness Act specifically makes an exemption for fire management. Well, it specifically calls out insect control and fire management, and for administrative uses. And you know, down in New Mexico in this wilderness, there was a lightning ignited fire. They let it burn, they monitored it, small fire, just kind of smoldering along. Next thing they know, winds pick up unexpectedly in New Mexico, as high winds sometimes. And that fire burned over 300 homes. It was a miracle no one died. It was a destructive fire at the time. It was a 2011 fire in New Mexico history, as far as I know. They ran the district ranger out of town. So it's, you know, there needs to be balance. And what we also need to acknowledge is like, and I struggle with this a lot. I mean, there's so many criticisms of wilderness nowadays. Wilderness is so under fire, I think, especially, you know, US and like, not just from the right. I mean, the right is like, oh, we want to extract resources and, you know, all that stuff. But from the left, I mean, I think the left is increasingly attacking wilderness for especially social justice issues. And I think, and there are a lot of valid concerns there. For example, you know, this idea of wilderness erasing Native American history, Native American use of the land, you know, especially with prescribed burns, and the removal of indigenous people has completely changed fire regimes. So the question is how to move forward. And I don't think there's such a simple answer. And I'm generally very hesitant about these things, but I don't think just hands off always is necessarily going to be the right answer. And I think it's going to make wilderness even less popular.
Well, like I said, and let's go on to the next presentation. Tobias, we will certainly talk again. I think the solution is not that difficult, because the first thing we could do is not call it wilderness anymore. Let's call it wild areas. Then at least we are true to the name. We are true to, we are true to what it really is. Because the worst thing we can do is use, and yes, you live in America and you have Mr. Fake News, to use fake labels. That's the only real comment that I was going to drive at. Are we actually labeling something that, because of the many driving anthropocenic efforts and impacts, will change and is not that anymore? But let's, I think next.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't know there was another presentation after this. Yeah, thank you all so much for your time. And my email was there.
Yes,
Tobias,
we'll get back to you.
So
say hi to John.
Will do.